Good evening, everyone. I'm John Punches, Extension Forester for Oregon State University, located up in La Grande, northeastern Oregon. I'm really pleased that you're joining us tonight for another webinar in our Fire Ecology of Oregon Forest series. So tonight, Chris Adlam is going to join us and chat with us about ecology in Southwest Oregon forests. But before we turn it over to him, I just want to remind everybody how we do question and answers in this. Since this is a webinar, you don't have like full access to your microphone to get to us by verbal. So what we're going to ask you to do is use the Q&A screen, a little function down there in the menu. Just click Q&A and type your question in. So please don't use raise your hand. We can't really accommodate that. Just put your questions for Chris in Q&A, and he's going to stop periodically during his presentation, and we'll answer questions then. And others of us are here to kind of assist with that process and keep things organized. If you have kind of general comments that don't directly relate to a question for Chris, feel free to drop those in the chat box, but please keep it nice. There's lots of folks here. We want to be respectful of each other. So with that, I'm going to ask Jake Putney to give us a reminder on how he takes care of the continuing education credits for these courses.
Yeah, thanks, John. Good evening, everyone. Continuing education credits are approved for this series for the Society of American Foresters, Associated Oregon Loggers, as well as the Certified Burn Manager program. For SAF, there is a form on the series website. If you download that form, fill in your name, email, and SAF number, as well as the keyword that I'll announce at the end of this session, I can get those credits recorded. You can return one form after tonight's session, or if you want to wait till the end of the series and just return that one form, that works as well. For Associated Oregon Loggers, if you just send me an email with your name and company you're representing, I will get those recorded, and same with Certified Burn Manager as well.
Thanks, Jake. And with that, Chris, we'll turn it over to you. Thanks again for being here.
Thanks, John, and good evening, everyone. Like John said, my name is Chris Adlam. I am the Regional Fire Specialist here in Southwest Oregon with the OSU Extension Fire Program. And I spent a lot of time in forests of Southwest Oregon and Northern California learning about fire. I spent a couple of seasons during my doctoral research in the Klamath Mountains, the Mid-Klamath area, which I'm going to talk quite a bit about today, in different burned areas, areas that had recently burned, areas that had burnt 30 years ago, areas that burnt hot, areas that burnt just a little underburn, and really trying to understand the role of fire in these ecosystems. So I'm happy to share a little bit of what we know about fire in this pretty complex but very fascinating region. So first of all, where are we located? Down here, the bottom left corner, you can see that blue blob peeking up into Oregon from California. That's the Klamath and Siskiyou Ranges, one of the forested ranges that we have here in the Pacific Northwest. We've already heard a little bit about some of these other mountain ranges in Northwest Oregon and Eastern Oregon. And so today we're going to dive into this region, the Klamath Mountain ecoregion. A lot of what I say will apply pretty well to adjacent areas of the South Cascades as well. But you know, this region, it extends from the California border in a narrowing kind of triangle all the way up to just about the southern end of the Willamette Valley. It just barely touches the southern end of the Willamette Valley. So encompassing the area from the upper Rogue Valley out to the coast and up to Roseburg. But of course, the majority of it is actually down there in California. That's the other side of that imaginary California border, California-Oregon line, and all the way down to Mendocino County, extending in the east around the area of Mount Shasta. Mount Shasta to Mount Lassen would be classified as the South Cascades still, but everything to the west of that, out to the coast, is this wonderful bioregion of the Klamath Mountains. I say it's a wonderful region. People call it sometimes the Galapagos of the North. It's a very biologically diverse region. It's classified by the World Wildlife Fund as one of the 200 most important locations worldwide for species diversity. Half of Oregon's 4,000 native plant species occur in this region, right? So that's pretty cool. I don't know if any of you are from here and maybe you want to jump on the chat and put in some of your favorite species from Southwest Oregon. That way we can share the beauty and the bounty with some of our guests from other parts of the state. I really love Lomatium, that one on the bottom left. It's a wild carrot type, and really love those. There are many, many species out here. Indian paintbrush, always a favorite. That Indian plume on the right, pedicularis, beautiful in the spring as well. So what's that got to do with fire? Fire is intricately linked to all of that biodiversity that's so phenomenal in this region. You can see the light green color on this map representing the ecology, the fire ecology of Oregon. You can see that color, light green, is corresponds to the frequent low severity fire regime. So we've discussed that previously, particularly for Eastern Oregon. It's present throughout the Blue Mountains and parts of the East Cascades, and extends up through the Willamette Valley as well. So this is predominantly the fire regime we find ourselves in here in the Klamath Mountains ecoregion. In modern times, it remains one of the places that sees actually the most fire activity, probably, of a lot of our western forests. So if you can see, you see this map, the top left, right? What is that? You know that area? Well, that red blob in that southwest corner of Oregon, that's the Kalmiopsis wilderness. It burnt in 1987 in the Silver Fire, it burned again in 2002 in the Biscuit Fire, burned again in 2017. Those are the Chetco Bar, the Taylor, Klondike. So it's had a lot of fires, and quite a lot of research has happened in that region. We'll be talking about that. And then if you look down in California, you can see that it's the same kind of similar pattern of lots and lots of fire in that portion of the Klamath Mountains as well. If we zoom into this area, you can see this is basically the area from Happy Camp to Orleans in the mid-Klamath region, the home of the Karuk tribe, and it is just so much fire, so much fire. In the last 20 years especially, much of this area has burned. There was some big fires in 87, and since then there's just that puzzle has kept filling in at the point where now when a new fire starts in this region, it very quickly often bumps into a previous fire, which is creating some interesting dynamics. So a lot of fire and a lot of biodiversity. We have ecosystems that, on that top left, if you looked at that real quick, you might think you're in Eastern Oregon, lots of ponderosa pine. But then what's that in the understory? There's these broadleaf trees, shrubs. What are they? Trees? Are they shrubs? There's a lot of madrone in this photo in the understory, right? So that's one of the things about the Klamath Mountain ecoregion that's really special. We have a lot of hardwood species, or broadleaf species if you prefer. And that includes the madrones, includes the oaks, many species of oaks, black oak, white oak, tan oak, canyon live oak, saddler oak are endemic oak species only found in the high elevations of this mountain range, as well as some other species like big leaf maple and various riparian trees as well. Top right, that is a forest of foxtail pines, a high altitude species with a very restricted range. It's very cool to find them. There are not many spots you can find those types of trees. So we have a collection of very unique species. This area is renowned as having the highest conifer diversity in the world. 18 species are found in 1 square mile, known as the Miracle Mile. Down in the bottom left, we have an illustration of the ecological diversity in some places. This is the Little Applegate Valley. You can see that in close proximity, we have chaparral, grassland, conifer forest, oak woodland, and all of this is tied to soil types and aspect and past fire influences. And that photo on the bottom right is from the Kalmiopsis wilderness looking east over Grants Pass. You can see, barely make out Mount McLaughlin in the distance there. And along with that ecological diversity, there's also a lot of cultural diversity in our region. We have numerous tribes that call this area home, and that have a long-standing practice of using fire. And to this day, many of the tribes in this region that have maintained that use of fire continue to advocate for that practice at the state level, at the national level, and promoting scientific research and other initiatives to help restore the use of traditional burning practices and help us understand our relationship with fire. The photo on the bottom left there, that is a picture of a cultural burn here in the Rogue Valley with members of the Siletz and Grand Ronde tribes. I personally have attended trainings with the Karuk tribe, the Yurok tribe. They have prescribed fire trainings every year that draw people from all over the world. The relationship of tribes here and fire is, of course, very deep. We also have people who are newcomers relatively to this area and who are, for example, homeowners. My neighbor there, top left, is setting fire to his land. He's got he's part of a prescribed burn association, right, and has learned to do this kind of thing, has received support from knowledgeable individuals to be able to return fire to the landscape and make his home safer. Top right is a picture of a rancher in Douglas County near Roseburg. Ranchers up there do a lot of burning. They have for many generations and have quite a lot of knowledge of how to apply fire to that particular landscape. So the ecological diversity, and the cultural diversity, I think of as being very linked, and I think that that's something we can learn from this landscape is so much fire and so many experiments and so much knowledge in different communities about fire that I think it's really a resource. So fire ecologically, a little recap of what we've learned, what you probably know. Fire does a lot of complicated things to an ecosystem. And every time we try to explain fire, it's a bit of a simplification, but it's like if we tried to explain rain, it would be a simplification. What does rain do? It does a lot of things, it turns out. And it's hard to really explain everything that rain does, but we take rain for granted. We never have to explain to strangers what rain does. That's sort of, everybody just is like, it's rain. We understand that it's part of the landscape. But fire we treat a little differently. We sometimes want to think of fire as a separate element that's not necessarily part of the landscape. And then when it comes to visit our landscape, then we ask all of these questions like, what does it do? What's happening? It's not something that we can take for granted because of our relationship to it. So, any case, some of the things that fire does, it removes the fuel from the surface, it recycles nutrients. We've talked in the previous lecture about the influence that can have on soils. It can prune the shrubs. I say prune, it doesn't really kill. Most of our shrubs grow back from the roots, they resprout. It raises the height of the lower branches by scorching those lower branches. So if the fire happens again in the future, it's less likely to be able to climb up into the canopy. It can regulate populations of various critters like insects, for example. It'll also create more nutrients, more nutritious food for browsers and ungulates because those resprouts from the shrubs are higher in protein content. So it has influence on various parts of the food chain. And of course, it helps mature trees be less vulnerable to future fires. And different species have adapted to fire in different ways. So this is cool. There's many ways to co-inhabit with fire. I think of that in terms of what does that mean for us? We probably also have many options for co-inhabiting with fire. Just like these species have essentially adapted in different ways. So ponderosa pine, we've already mentioned it. So a little review here. Ponderosa pine has some attributes that make it adapted to fire. It prunes itself. Its lower branches fall off. That prevents fire from climbing up and killing the whole tree. It also has thick bark that flakes off, prevents moss and lichen from growing on the tree, which also carry the fire up into the crown. It also has buds that are protected by long needles, right? You can see that photo on the right. There was some heat from a fire, scorched the needles, but the bud was protected and that branch is going to regrow. And in a year's time, you probably won't be able to tell that that tree was ever scorched. And of course, the tree also likes to have some open areas for its seeds to germinate on bare, sunny ground. So in those ways, ponderosa pine is adapted to fire. Its needles are also quite flammable, so when they fall, it will burn. It's more likely to burn, and that's what that pine tree wants. It wants more fire, low to the ground, mellow fire, like you can see in this picture. Other trees have taken a different approach. This is a knobcone pine, and a knobcone pine is a common tree, a relatively common tree on the maritime side of our ecoregion here. And it is known for its specialty, which is having serotinous cones. And what that means is these are cones that only open when a fire comes through and heats them up and melts the resin. And then that'll liberate the seeds. So the parent tree dies in fire, but the seeds are liberated and will grow in that bare ground, free of competition. And so it's sort of compared sometimes to the phoenix, right? It's kind of the idea that fire will engulf the parent tree, but it'll be able to reproduce. It's, to be honest, it hedges its bets a little bit and also has some resistance to low severity fire. Its bark is not as thin as some fire sensitive species, and occasionally the odd cone will pop open even without fire, so it can reproduce at times between fires as well. But overall, it's one that's chosen a different approach to adapting to fire, which is embracing really hot fires. And today, I have to say, that's quite a successful strategy in many parts of its range. Another example is the brewer spruce. This is an endemic species in our region. It only grows in the Klamath Mountains. It has a fairly restricted range, and it is quite fire sensitive. It really doesn't do well with fire. It's got a thin bark. Any heat pretty much will kill a brewer spruce, and its drooping branches are not really resistant to fire, kind of promotes fire climbing up. And the young trees don't really do well in a totally open area after a hot fire. So what's up with that? That's really interesting, right? This is an area that had a lot of fire, always had for many, many hundreds or thousands of years, and yet it has these fire sensitive species. Well, I think it's not a coincidence, actually, and it's not actually a paradox, because what's happening is that these trees are growing in relatively rocky areas, sometimes on north-facing slopes, and these are places that, under historic conditions, would have not burnt very easily, right? There would have been a lot of fire all around in different parts of the landscape, and that fire in the other parts of the landscape would be reducing the amount of fuel and reducing the intensity of future fire. And so in that way, essentially, the brewer spruce was actually benefiting from the presence of fire on the landscape, right? That fire around its habitat would be essentially doing defensible space for it, right? Nowadays, we've seen large populations of brewer spruce wiped out by wildfire because there's so much fuel all across the landscape that when a fire is coming into the habitat of a brewer spruce, it's not going to slow down because it's a little rocky, or it's a north-facing slope, or this or that or the other thing. Those features tend to be overwhelmed by the intensity of fires driven by heavy fuel loads. So the irony is that brewer spruce, while fire sensitive, also in a certain way depends on having good fire on the landscape, if you will. And that makes me think a little bit of our society today. I live in a completely wooden cabin inside of a forest. And I'm a bit like a brewer spruce. If fire came here, it probably wouldn't be doing great. I wouldn't be doing great. But, I would benefit from having fire around my community to reduce the risk of, if that fire happens, when it happens, of it being more intense. So in a way, I identify with the brewer spruce. Okay, some other species that have divergent strategies for adapting to fire. Manzanitas. Fire ecologists love manzanitas because while they're all, one genus, and they're all related closely, right? But they've chosen, quote unquote, two different approaches to living with fire. That green one, you can see, it's bigger than the white ones, right? That's because that one is a resprouter. the fires come through this area, the green one's resprouted, and because it's a resprouted, it's got a big root system, it can grow faster than the others. So that's good, right? But the downside is it's the same individual growing again and again, right? So there's no genetic diversity happening. Whereas the white ones, they have seeds that mature post-fire. They don't resprout. If the fire comes through, the adults that were there before die, but the seeds in the seed bank will grow. So they can't grow as fast. It's harder to grow from a seed than from a root. But A, there's more of them, and B, there's more genetic diversity there because every time they reproduce, right, there's natural selection happening. And so if the environment's changing, they're more able to change with the environment for that reason. The downside of that strategy is that if the fire becomes too common and those plants don't have the time to mature and make their own seeds, then that population could get wiped out. So if with too frequent fire, that would not be a good strategy. So different manzanitas, different solutions for living with fire. Different solutions for living with fire. This quote here is from a man we know as Klamath River Jack, and he was living around the early 20th century. He's a native man living on the Klamath River, and he was writing at this time to the Forest Service ranger in Orleans because he did not agree with the new practice at the time of putting all fires out. And so he was trying to explain in his letter why he thought this was a bad idea. And so this is an excerpt from that letter. He says this: "Injun burn every year just same, so keep all ground clean. No bark, no dead leaf, no old wood on ground, no old wood on brush, so no bug can stay to eat leaf and no worm can stay to eat berry or acorn. Not much on ground to make hot fire, so never hurt big trees where fire burn." So he's explaining why native people have always used fire, right? And the fact that that was their way of adapting to this landscape was putting fire on the ground in certain ways to achieve certain benefits. For example, the production of berries, acorns, and also to reduce the intensity of fires. We can see in the record that indeed fire was very common in these areas. We've talked about dendrochronology in the past in some of our other lectures, so I'm not going to go into the methodology in detail. You maybe attended those lectures and should be familiar with that now, but basically scientists can go back in time by looking at tree rings and counting fire scars and cross-dating the fire scars to know when those fires happen, and through that method figure out how often fire burnt in a certain area. This study by Kerry Metlin and et al. And his co-authors found a fire return interval in the Rogue Valley of about 8 years, right? So that's a lot of fire, 8 years. In my lifetime, you know, that would be like this place would have burnt 5 times, right? And it's burned, of course, 0 times right here, although I can see 3 megafires in different directions when I look out my window. So, you know, getting close. Now, this study, one thing that I like to look at too out of this study is some of the details. When we look at the data that they collected, you can see they collected data from different sites throughout the Rogue Basin. Some areas all the way up by Ashland, some areas downstream of Grants Pass, up the Applegate, Illinois Valley. And when we look at the fire return interval, the median fire return interval, in some of the areas, it was as low as 5 or 6 years. In some areas, higher elevations, maybe as much as 12 or 14 years. Overall, 8 years. Now, one thing I like to look at here that I think is really interesting is this column here, the disruption. This is the time when the fire regime abruptly changed during the settlement era. Some of the sites changed in the early 1850s, right? So let's think about what happened in the early 1850s in the Rogue Valley, right? Jacksonville was the largest town in Oregon at the time. Gold Rush and the Rogue Indian Wars happened. And at that time, in 1856, many of the tribes from this area were forcibly removed to the Siletz and Grand Ronde reservations. right? And so you can see that some of these sites, that coincides with the time when the fire regime abruptly changed. And these three sites are some of the lower elevation kind of places where you would expect um, more use of those areas. And perhaps you would expect less lightning because lightning tends to hit in higher areas. But then there's other areas that you see that disruption, that change happening in 1905. What happened in 1905? 1905 was the creation of the Forest Service and the beginning of the policy of fire exclusion, right? And so this is when effort was starting to be put towards putting out fire, including in remote areas. And these are some of the more remote areas, higher elevation areas that would have had probably a lot of lightning, keeping that fire regime going through that time frame. I like historical quotes, so it really helps, I think, to understand how people saw themselves and saw their environment at the time. This is a quote from Clinton Baker, who was a part of the Red River Lumber Company. He was writing in 1938, reminiscing about his youth, and this is what he describes. This is describing the area around Mount Lassen in the South Cascades. He says, during the summer months, up to the time the National Forest Service took over the control of the forests, the fires used to run practically unchecked and uncontrolled over the entire area. Fires burned here and there every summer, and no one was apprehensive of the results, excepting where some improvements were endangered, a rail fence or a building or the like. In about 1910, the Forest Service took charge of the forests, and their first thoughts and efforts were to eliminate fire from the forests. Why the foresters ever decided to reverse the processes of nature in our forests, where the results were so eminently successful, I could never understand. So this timber company, they used fire in their extensive forests in order to reduce the risk of losing their assets in a high severity fire, and they were pretty upset about the policy of putting fires out. When you go for a hike in the Klamath Mountains, you're bound to find these trees or stumps with these cat-faced scars. And I always love to get down in there and look and count how many fire scars I can see. This one here pictured is from the Applegate Valley, and you can see that they're very narrow layers. Each layer is a successive fire, and very few years would pass in between successive fires, right? Another quote here from General Joseph Lane. He was an instrumental figure during the Rogue Indian Wars and was there for the signing of the treaties in the early 1850s. He came back in 1884 and he noticed some changes on the landscape in that 30 years. He said this: the hilltops, now covered by dense thickets of manzanita, madrone, or evergreen brush, were then devoid of bushes and trees because of the Indian habit of burning over the surface to remove obstructions to their seed and acorn gathering. We have similar quotes like this one from this ethnographer in Humboldt County describing what he's noticed and heard from other people. Within the forests at all elevations were small open patches known locally as prairies, producing grass, ferns, and various small plants. These prairies are too numerous to mention. Most patches, if left to themselves, would doubtless soon have produced forests, but the Indians were accustomed to burn them manually so as to gather various seeds. Professor Jepson says that today there is more wooded area in Humboldt County than when the white man came, and I have confirmed this with interviews. That's from 1918. That's over 100 years ago. But this is my favorite quote. It was published by an anonymous writer sharing his opinion, or her opinion, I don't know, in the Jacksonville Democratic Times right here in the Rogue Valley in 1903. One of the greatest pieces of folly is preventing fires to be set in the hills and government reservations until the brush and undergrowth become so high and thick that when the inevitable fire comes, the whole forest is destroyed. Old settlers and Indians know that the only safe method is to annually burn off the undergrowth when it is so thin that it would not endanger the big trees. Then the grass can grow and you have a beautiful forest instead of a fire trap. I think that that's more eloquent than a lot of scientific papers I've read. But anyway, so bottom right, you can left here, you can see this large tree. This was an oak tree, probably a black oak. And you can see by the knobbly bits low down, it used to have branches from the base all the way up. And over many, many decades, these Doug firs have grown up around it and completely shaded it out, and it's died. And now instead of one large black oak in this area, you have, 100 small-ish Douglas firs. Oftentimes you'll see scenes like that second photo as well. A lot of small trees in the Applegate Valley. It's really dry, less than 20 inches of precipitation a year, and these trees grow extremely slowly. And you'll sometimes come across this remnant of what used to be there, a large tree, and sometimes just lying down, surrounded by all of these small, sickly trees. I used to live around there and would sometimes prune these trees. And I mean, you can't even see the growth rings without a magnifying lens, or even better, a microscope. Some of these trees 100 years old would be only a few inches across, because of the competition. Then that next picture, you can see a large pine. This again is typical of some of these areas. You can see very few old growth trees surrounded by very large numbers of younger trees. And of course, when the fire comes, it's as this quote describes, this is what it can look like. In this case, that's a Slater fire, which was really, really high severity over large area. So maybe we should take some questions. Are there any questions, John?
Yeah, there are. This was a good time for that. So, we have questions from both Alyssa and Ethan that ask, kind of relating back to the map early on that showed all of the overlapping fires in this region that you talked about.
Yeah.
And so in your opinion, your estimation, is that a good thing that we're having enough fire that's overlapping? Is that representative of what might have been a historic burn interval, or are they burning differently? And then, like, with that, could you like comment on some of the ecological impacts of those overlapping fires?
That's a good question, and I'm going to talk a lot about the ecological impact of high severity fire later. So I'm not going to go into it too much. And sneak peek to what I'm going to talk about, though. But part of it is the lack of fire is really damaging to a lot of our ecosystems that are dependent on fire, right? And so when you see a lot of fire, even sometimes things that you don't really like, high severity patches, maybe there's some downsides to that. We lose something. Maybe it's old growth trees, something that we're not going to get back anytime soon, you know? But you got to weigh that against areas that have not seen fire in a really long time, which, you look at this photo, the second one from the left here, from a distance, it looks like a postcard, all green trees. But, you walk around in here and there's nothing growing on the forest floor. You don't see any animals. You don't hear insects, and the lack of fire really causes these forests to become a lot less diverse over time. So, yeah, it's complicated. There's downsides to the way that fires are burning today, but also fire is inevitable and it is important for many species. So, I think I'll talk more about those things later. But if you feel like I didn't answer your question, you can ask it again at the end.
Okay. Um, do you have any articles or links that people could go to get access to more of that, like Native American knowledge, the old surveyors, old foresters, folks are interested in some of the quotes that you've been able to surface?
There are several articles that I could link to in and on the website. Yes. There are also some books that people have been writing even recently with input from um, tribal folks. Kari Norgard wrote a book, Salmon and Acorns Feed Our People, which was a book written with a lot of collaboration with folks from the Kuruk tribe, and it's a little bit academic in part, but it really does also weave together the perspective of folks on landscape changes and how that's affecting them. Um, and there are some other books that have been very interesting and relied on interviews with native experts. So Tending the Wild by Kat Anderson, if folks are not familiar with that book, that is a very readable book and very, very good. It's provides a lot of context to Native American land management, and it importantly did rely on actually talking to Native people, which, funnily enough, prior to that book being written, was a less common type of thing in anthropology of recent times. People would study archaeology and points and this and that, and then Dr. Anderson really went out, spent a lot of time with people, with elders, and listening, and wrote this amazing book. It's quite a big book too. So I'd recommend that, Tending the Wild. Well, let's put some resources together on the website.
Yeah. So we've got the website all set up so we can get some of those from Chris and get them posted there. And then just before you leave this picture there, you're showing that burn area there. One of our viewers asked, what burn was that again? Do you know what particular burn that is that's being shown there?
That's the one on the right. That's the Slater fire from 2020.
Great. All right. I think that's a good place to stop with these questions for now, and we'll let you go on, and we'll just look forward to really, I think most of the stuff that people are asking is stuff that you're going to get to.
Yeah. So let's dive a little bit more into this relationship of people and fire over time. This is one of my favorite scientific studies, y'all, so I'm happy to share it with you. And there's a lot going on here, right? But let's dive into this. These researchers went out and took a lot of cores of trees, as we've already heard, the methodology. This was for the Sierra Nevada, but there's also similar data for our Klamath-Mountain ecoregion. And they were looking for a relationship between fire activity, which is the top graph, right? The bars, those vertical bars, that's how much fire activity there was from about 1600 to the present. And so a tall bar would be a lot of fire activity, a shorter one, less fire activity. And then there's that horizontal bar, right, that has a little jumps, like a little staircase thing going on. That is that they use an algorithm to figure out time periods where the pattern was relatively homogeneous, right? So kind of evening out, otherwise it's just a lot of black bars, right? But with that algorithm, they could sort out the different eras. Their hypothesis was that this would correspond to the climate data, which is presented below. They had a couple different climatic variables there, but to their dismay, they didn't find what they were looking for. They thought there's something wrong with the data or something. And eventually they looked at this and they looked at the dates of these eras and they went, wait a minute, this isn't climate, this is what's going on with people, right? What's going on with people is what's creating these four distinct eras. You can see those colors in the background of the graph. So the green era on the left, that is what they call the Native American era. And it goes up until the late 1700s, right? This is, again, Sierra Nevada. So the late 1700s that's the mission era. So people are being removed from the ancestral lands and moved to missions, which are basically concentration camps. And many of them died. At the same time, in 1793, the Mexican governor declared that cultural burning was illegal, 1793. And so at that time, people were no longer able to burn as much. And what do we actually see? Fire activity increases, right? So that's kind of odd, right? But in fact, what's happening is because people are not on the landscape burning patches, what happens is the fuel accumulates. And when it does burn, it burns a lot hotter, right? And so you see these spikes now in that brown era. You see these spikes in fire activity, and then some years with less, and then it spikes again, right? Because that's what's happening then. The fuel's accumulating, and then fire gets hotter. In about 1850, then it's the gold rush. Fire activity at that point goes down because people are bringing in lots, and I mean lots and lots of cattle and sheep to feed the new settlers. At that time, also California banned cultural burning again. You know, it was one of the first laws created by the state of California when it was created. And um, and the cattle, meanwhile, and all the sheep were grazing down the grass, and so that actually tempers the fire behavior because the fuel continuity is decreased, and that those fires can't spread as much. And again, we're talking about numbers of sheep and cattle that boggle the mind, you know, compared to today. Um, and then again, that famous date of 1905, 1910, roughly, and that fire decreases again and ends up being pretty low through the 20th century. So that's the fire suppression era. Now, let's look at this inset up here. This little inset is a little zooming into the 20th century, right? And doing that same methodology again, looking at the different eras for that time frame. What you can see is that in the early 20th century, there was a little bit more fire activity. Fire suppression was not as effective. A lot of slash was being left on the ground by logging operations, and that was fueling fires. Various things are happening. Then in the mid 20th century, we have a cooler, wetter period. And you can actually see that in that blue line below, right? You see the blue line? It follows the same pattern as that black line for the 20th century, right? So that mid-century period, we were kind of more successful at fire suppression. There was also a lot more resources, soldiers coming back from World War II, dozers, you know, airplanes. We were adding a lot of technology. And then in the late 20th century, it increases again. But the key point is that during the 20th century, magically, it seems, we get back in sync with climate, right? That fire activity gets back in sync with that blue line, the climate pattern. And that's really interesting, right? Why is this happening? This is happening because we've removed the influences of fuel as a limitation on fire activity. Before that, fuel was the limiting factor. And so if the climate was a little bit warmer or a little bit wetter, that didn't alone influence the fire activity. But during the 20th century, we've removed the influence of fuel. Now there's no limitation from that perspective. There's just fuel everywhere across our dry forests, unbroken many places, right? And so now climate is in the driver's seat of that pattern. It's a bit like if you're on a slope in a car and you take off the parking brake, right? The fuel is kind of like the parking brake. It's the only thing that's holding the car back. The slope is, otherwise it's there, right? The climate is there. Sometimes we have dry years. That's just how it is. With climate change, we're increasing, of course, the dryness and the number of dry years. But now we've taken the brake off and now there's only the slope. So, of course, that's what's happening now is that climate in these forests has a lot more influence on fire activity than it used to, because in the past, people, native people especially, kept fuel as a limiting factor that prevented fires from getting more intense. So that study was over a very large scale, but we're going to take a look at a different study at a smaller scale. This is a study, 2 lakes on the mid-Klamath area, just south of the California-Oregon border in the Klamath Mountains, Fish Lake and Lake Ogaramtok. And these lakes were studied for a couple of reasons. Fish Lake is an area used ancestrally and today by the Yurok and Karuk tribes. Lake Ogaramtok is used by the Karuk tribe only. And we know that because of archaeological studies and because of traditional knowledge, we know that people have often spent time out there burning and gathering different resources. And the lakes themselves are great for providing a tool to look back in time. Just like when we look at tree rings, we can go back in time, and the further back you go into the tree, the further into the tree you go, the more you go back into time. Lakes are the same way. Sediment is depositing in the bottom of the lake, and you can take a core, and the more you go back down into the layers, the more you're going back in time. And these layers collect things like pollen, which can tell you a lot about what trees are there, because pollen grains are different for each species of tree. So you know what the composition was, you know how much of each species was there. And then charcoal is also accumulating in the lake, and you can tell how much fire activity there is because of that. So this is what they found at these two lakes. We're going to look at the bottom graphs first. One thing they were interested in was the fact that over the last 1,000+ years, we've had a couple eras. One of them was the medieval climatic anomaly, MCA, on this graph. And that was a time frame that was warmer than the average over the past thousands of years. Then that was followed shortly after by the Little Ice Age, which was a cooler period than the average. And so theoretically, you would expect that there'd be more fire during the warmer period and less fire during the cooler period. Because if climate is alone in charge of what's going on, then that's what you would expect, that you'd see those patterns lining up. So at Fish Lake, what we see is that actually fire activity increased very significantly about 1,500 years ago. And that is clearly quite a bit before the medieval climatic anomaly. So it's not climate related. That was actually a relatively cool period. And it corresponds to a time when we know populations were increasing in the area. People were moving out into different areas and intensifying their use of different resources like acorns. And associated with that, they were presumably burning more, right? And that's what this seems to indicate. The fire use really started to increase about 1,500 years ago. And then, if anything, it seems to start to come down during the medieval climatic anomaly, which is, again, that warm period. And then during the Little Ice Age, it goes back up. So we don't see the expected pattern for fire if climate was in charge of, directing the amount of fire on the ground. So this shows that native people at that time were adapting their burning patterns. During the Little Ice Age, they were probably having to go out and burn a little bit more because it's a wetter period. Vegetation is growing more, right? And so in order to maintain those oak trees and maintain those other species, they're probably having to compensate by burning more. That's over here on this right side of that little bump there. Now, at Lake Ogoramtok, it's similar, but a little bit different here. We see a jump again at around 1,500 years ago in fire use. It doesn't climb as much and stays relatively constant during the medieval climatic anomaly, that warm period. And then it ends up peaking actually during the Little Ice Age before, coming back down around 1850 with colonization. So again, we can see that increase in fire use, presumably because of people's activity. Interestingly, this graph, the graph at the top, the graphs, both of them are representing the biomass of the forest. And that they calculated based on the amount of pollen. They can figure out how much pollen there is at different layers, different times, and that they can equate with a certain amount of each species and calculate the biomass of the forest that was present. So the interesting thing is that you look over that 1,500-year period, and the biomass of the forest is low, around 75 tons per hectare, perhaps, but it's relatively constant, right? It doesn't change. You don't see a lot of increase and decrease, right? That level of biomass remains pretty constant, pretty stable. On the right-hand side of that graph, you see some weird stuff happening that seems to plummet and then go back up, and then it drops again and then it goes back up. That's because of logging activities during the 20th century. During that era in around Fish Lake, there were some pretty big clear cuts that, of course, reduced the biomass quite a bit and affected the amount of pollen accumulating in the lake. But then you can see how quickly that biomass comes right back. And today we have almost 250 tons per hectare of biomass in that forest, as opposed to that historic 75. So we've had a tripling of the amount of biomass, despite, a couple of logging operations that have happened in that era. So it's really distinct. The impact of regular burning year after year over long time periods in stabilizing that biomass is very different from what we've seen across the 20th century of biomass suddenly dropping and then quickly coming way back up and even exceeding the historic levels because of the logging that happened then. Now, on the right, at Lake Agaramtok, we see something fairly similar, pretty constant levels of biomass during the last 1,500 years of higher use of this area. And today, that biomass level has jumped to 300 tons per hectare from about, again, 50 to 100. So a tripling at least of the amount of biomass in these forests from the lack of fire. So this graph, this was created by Jesse Thorson, a former OSU student, in a paper that was recently published. And I like it because it's showing sort of what I'm trying to explain here. On the left side, what you see is that with regular fire over long periods on the left, you can see that the amount of area burned is pretty stable over time, right? And so fire in that time period is a stabilizing factor, right? That fire stabilizes the amount of biomass in the forest, and it stabilizes, therefore, the amount of burning that's happening year to year. Then fire suppression happens, that fire suppression era, the amount of area burned sharply decreases, but then we start to get these years of really intense fire activity and high severity burns across large areas. And so now fire has become not a stabilizing factor, but a destabilizing factor, both for our forests and for our human communities. I don't think many people would feel like fire is something that brings stability, right? But that was what was happening in the past. Now we've entered the new era of fire as something that brings this destabilizing feedback. One way we can see this is looking at the effect of high severity fire on old growth forests today, right? We have had quite a big increase in high severity fire. We have now across our dry forests in the West, about 36% of the area burned in a typical wildfire on average is high severity fire. Historically, that would have been 6 to 9%. So we've had a much increase in the proportion of high severity fire. This is a study from the Sierra Nevada. Again, I'm having to lean on some research from out of area, but it's interesting because they did some models to look at how does high severity fire affect the amount of old growth forest that we can sustain on the landscape. Historically, there was 7% of the area burned was high severity. So with that, you could sustain about half of the landscape in an old growth forest state. But today, we have 30% of that mountain range, and this is from 2017, it's probably even more now, but in any case, 30% of the area burn is high severity. So now that there's more high severity, we're going to be seeing a lower proportion of the land that can at any given time, be in an old growth stage. And indeed, they found that it's about 13%. So only 13% of the landscape over time can be in a stable form in an old growth forest state. So while in the past fire was maintaining 50% of that forest in an old growth state, now it's really gonna start eating away at that and decreasing our amount of old growth forest. From 1993 to 2017, we lost about 6 to 7% of the old growth forest in the Northwest Forest Plan area to wildfire. And over that same time frame, we lost about 2% to logging. So we're losing old growth forest to wildfire about 3 times faster than we're losing it to logging. So this is reason for concern for a lot of the species that depend on these types of ecosystems. The other concern is that fires will tend to reburn at the same severity that they initially burned. So this study from the Kalmiopsis wilderness found that areas that burned in the Biscuit fire tended to reburn at the same severity as they'd initially burned 15 years before in the Silver fire. So if it had burnt first at a high severity, it would burn again at a high severity. If it burned first at low severity, it tended to burn again at low severity. And in that study, they also found that salvage logged areas that were replanted very densely tended to burn even hotter than the areas that had not been managed in that way. So reburns are a concern. That partially is an answer to what that question earlier of all of that fire, right? Is it good? Is it not good? Well, you know, it's complicated. Some of these areas are burning again really fast and not allowing for forest regeneration. And that's probably not great, right? If it's over a large area. So that's a lot of doom and gloom, okay? But I wanna change the tone a little bit here to say that, you know, I think that we've learned to see fire as an enemy. We've learned to think of fire as destructive. And I don't really want to play into that, right? There's some things to be concerned about, but fire is important for these landscapes. And even high severity fire, it's complicated, right? First of all, like I said earlier, we have to think about what are we comparing it to? So an area of high severity fire might look alarming, but look at that photo on the top left. What is that? That's an area that's not seen fire in 100 years. And there's basically nothing growing there, right? There's very little growing there. There are no wildflowers or pollinators. There's no browse for deer, right? So this is, remember, this is a hotspot of biodiversity. This is the Galapagos of the North. And this is what we've turned it into, just dead sticks and leaves, right? So that's always something that I find very hard to notice, is just how devoid of diversity some of these fire suppressed stands are. And then after the fire, even a high severity fire, any species that you find in that unburnt area will be there right after. While high severity fire does not tend to wipe out any of the species that were initially there. All the species are very adapted to fire, very resilient to fire. So that photo on the right, that's an area that burned. There's some green trees. It's maybe not super high severity, but you can see that all the species that were there before are coming back, and you can see a lot of sword fern, right, which we'd associate with a shady, unburnt forest. It'll come right back after a fire, even a high severity fire. So there are very few species that are actually lost when a high severity fire comes through an area. So that's encouraging. There are actually a lot of species that are added, right? There are some species that actually need that open forest, especially now that so many of our unburnt forests have become so thick and dense. The species that need the sunlight, the only place they're going to find that nowadays pretty much is in a high severity burn area. That could be things like fireweed on the right that have seeds that will parachute into the area. It could be bulbs like this Bollander's lily or this corn lily, you know, or many of the small and sometimes, you know, unspectacular, but also important little native grasses and other things that will flourish after a high severity fire. So it's not all bad. Also, a lot of our trees are resprouters. A lot of our hardwoods will come back from the roots. And this is a good thing. That photo on the left, that's big leaf maple in a kind of wetter area. And they grow back really quickly. The shrub in between is black-cap raspberry. About 4 to 5 years after a high severity fire, that black-cap raspberry, delicious. And then that photo on the right, you know, that was a really hot fire. You can see there's like nothing growing there. It really hammered that area. But the tan oak that was there is sprouting back, and that is creating shelter for animals. The leaves are gonna fall and replenish the soil. And so we are likely to have a lot of these resprouting shrubs. In 10 to 15 years, you might not agree with me. There'll be a wall of vegetation, and it gets really complicated to manage. So there's a downside to having all of these resprouting species, but at least the forest cover can recover pretty quickly. And there are also many shrubs that resprout or that grow after high severity fire. That's kind of our specialty in the Klamath Mountains, all these broadleaf shrubs, whether that's mock orange or elderberry. We've got lots of manzanita. We've got lots of ceanothus. We've got thimbleberry. We got all sorts of shrubs that come up that have flowers, that have fruits of many kind, and that are important habitat. And high severity fire, in a landscape that previously, up until 20, 30 years ago, a lot of this landscape was just solid, unburnt forest with, in a lot of places, relatively low diversity. High severity fire does introduce an element of diversity, especially when, not every single tree is killed. We can find these patchworks of different habitats, and that's important for a lot of species. If we look at birds, for example, right? Birds will find a home in any of these different habitat types. Brand new burnt forests like this, hairy woodpeckers love that. Townsend solitaires up in the treetops going and catching little insects flying by. The dark-eyed junco on the forest floor, very adaptable. Places that burn a couple times that have this structural diversity, some shrubs, some trees, a little bit of grass mixed in there. We'll have birds like this lazuli bunting, quite common out here, very beautiful. Rufous hummingbird, that is a bird that's declined a lot across its range. And, glad to know that it's benefiting in some way from this type of fire. Because there's all these shrubs that provide nectar for, hummingbirds. A lot of other species that like shrubs and open areas, towhees and sparrows. And then after time goes by and we end up with this brush field that, like I said, some people consider a management headache, but a wren tit considers that heaven. And that's one of my favorite birds. So, they'll be skulking around in there along with a McGillivray's warbler and various other little warblers and grosbeaks that love these shrubs, love how all these broadleaf shrubs that we have, lots of insects in there to eat, lots of food. So high severity fire is not all bad. And it's important to remember that we still are lacking fire across this landscape. Most of the landscape is impoverished in fire. We have a fire drought, okay? So I've talked about high severity fire. It is increasing, but overall, the amount of fire on the landscape is still far below what it used to be. So this is a brand new article looking at areas all across North America, right? So remember the tree rings? They looked at all of the tree rings in all of the places. And then they went and looked how many places burned in each year, right? So I forget how many sites there were, but a huge number of sites across not just the United States, but also Canada. And they found that in the past, the blue lines, that's how many sites burned on average in that given year. So for example, right there, you see the highest bar is kind of around 3, 4, 5%, right? 3, 4, 5. The 4 is a little bit up above the others. So let's say 4%, that 4% bar, blue bar. 4% of sites was the highest proportion, right? So that's how many sites would burn. I'm failing to explain this. It's the proportion, okay, it's the proportion of years that had that many sites burned. So the most years would have, 4% or, around there of sites burnt across this whole area, across North America. And if you go all the way to the right of the graph, there's 1 year, it's 1748. 1748, that's the bar all the way to the right. In 1748, 29% of all the sites in North America burned. Could you imagine? That's like 1/3 of all of North America burned, or at least of the places that have these sites. It's huge. It's hard to comprehend the amount of fire that was there. 1729, big year, 21% of sites burned. 1685, big year, 19% of sites burned. Nowadays, there's the pink bars. Would you say that's pink or orange? And most years we have 0% of the sites burning, right, actually, or, 1 or 2% of our sites across the region burning. So a lot less fire. And 2020 is on there. That's 6% of sites burned in 2020. And that's not exceptional for historical conditions. We thought 2020 was just like a huge fire year, but for historical years, it wasn't exceptional. Now, this is talking about area burned, right? Not severity. So let's remember those are different things. Most of these fires burning were low severity. So here in the Klamath Mountain ecoregion, historically there would have been about 400,000 acres burning. This is the Klamath Mountain region for Oregon. I'm not including California here. So that's a huge area burn. If you think of it basically being the Rogue Valley and a little bit up into the Umpqua Valley, 400,000 acres would burn about every year. So today we have less than 10% of the area burnt on average, right? So we have this fire deficit, which of course is contributing to why there's so much fuel accumulating and fires are getting so hot. That's part of the wildfire paradox. The more we put fires out, the more the fuel builds up, the worse fires get, and the less able we are to put them out. So the lack of fire and the high severity fire, these are two things that happen. They kind of go hand in hand. And for some species like the sugar pine, this is a really big problem. This is a species that is vulnerable to both the really hot high severity fires blowing through and killing the larger trees. It's also vulnerable to diseases like white pine blister rust, and it's really susceptible to competition. So in an area that hasn't burned, the density of trees is slowly choking out sugar pines. So sugar pines, they're not having an easy time. They die either with the absence of fire because of competition, or they die in high severity fires, right? It's like they can't win. So especially in parts like the Western Cascades and the Southern Sierra Nevada, we're seeing a really strong decline in sugar pines. Oaks have also declined a lot in our mixed forests here. I told you oaks are a very important part of our forests. We have many species relative to the rest of the Pacific Northwest. But they are half as common today as they used to be. This graph on the right, you can see the density of trees today versus historically, or the frequency. And this is for the Six Rivers National Forest area, a little bit to the south of here. So Douglas fir has increased significantly, but oaks have been cut in half in their frequency. And the little graph there on the left also shows settlement area versus contemporary density of trees, right, in stems per hectare, and also the basal area. And so you can see how much denser these forests have become, and that's what's choking out species like oak trees. It's hard to know what a healthy forest even looks like anymore, to be honest. Not to be a downer, but it's really hard to go to a place where we can see what it used to look like. I want to show you a couple pictures from this area called the Applegate Fuels Demo. It's a research plot in the Applegate Valley, and they tried out different thinning methods and full ecological restoration of these sites. So these three sites used to look very similar about 10 to 15 years ago, and they implemented on the left light fuels reduction, just cutting material under 4 inches. Then in the middle, a little bit bigger, they went up to 8 inches. That represents sort of the standard fuels reduction. And then on the right, you can see the ecological restoration treatment. And so what do you see? A lot fewer trees on the right. It's true. You can see the sky. It's a lot more open. I also noticed a lot of grass. And there were a lot of grass. There was a lot of wildflowers. Because there was a lot of wildflowers, I just remember the sound of the bees. You could notice from going from the photo in the middle, you could walk over to the other site and just hear all of a sudden the bees, the birds, right? It sounds different, right? anybody can tell the difference between, these overstocked forests and the restored area, which is probably not perfect. It's gone through a lot of damage from 100 years of fire suppression, and they haven't burned there yet, so it's not a full restoration, I would say, but a lot of improvement. The oak trees are also filling out and gaining a lot of crown, so that was cool to see. This is the same three treatments, a different area. On the left, light fuels reduction. You can see a couple old growth pines and then a bunch of ingrowth of Douglas firs. In the middle, non-commercial thinning, a little bit more open, still pretty bare ground, just sticks and dead leaves. And then the ecological restoration photo on the right, that one was taken in the fall. It's a little bit harder to see, the grass is all dry, but a lot more understory. The hardwoods are really filling in, a lot more structural diversity and a lot of more biodiversity response. We hope to go out there and do some plots and actually be able to give you some data in the future, but we're not quite there yet. So that quote from Klamath River Jack, remember from earlier? His letter went on to say this: "Now white man never burn. He passed law to stop all fire in forest and wild pasture. White man say he don't understand why wild berry get small and more few every year, and acorn get all wormy, and no more grassland. Why no and why deer die when they eat sour grass under brush and tree made sour by too much shade. Indian know, and by white man say he know too, but white man say, Indians say, white man, you know too late." And we are pretty late in learning some of these lessons, but they are being learned. This is a quote from the former head of the U.S. Forest Service, 2018, saying, "We must take the long view, accepting the inevitability of fire visiting our landscapes and preparing ourselves so that when fire does come calling, the consequences are not devastating. Whenever possible, we need to reintroduce fire under conditions we choose. Fire is the primary change agent on many of our federal lands and has been for millennia." I want to just finish by showing you some photos, something I thought was very cool. This is again from that mid-Klamath area around Orleans. You can see the Klamath River running north to south there, and the Salmon River coming in from the bottom right. And this fire here, this was the Perch Fire in 2023, very close to the town of Orleans. It started on the top of the mountain, Orleans Mountain, and it started to back down as lightning fire. And what happens is that an incident management team flies in from some other part of the country to take care of this wildfire. And their strategy was going to be, they were going to go and put this fire out, this fire that's backing down. You can see the severity map, right? There's some red, high severity a little bit, but a lot of it was pretty low severity. It was green and some of that blue, very low severity fire backing down the mountain. And they were going to go put it out. And the local people in Orleans said, "No, we don't want you to do that. We want you to let that fire come down all the way to our town. Because if you put it out halfway up the mountain, we're going to have this huge area of unburnt fuel from us all the way up to there. Let it come down to our neighborhoods. Let it burn so that we can have that beneficial fire around our community." And the incident management team, had this dialogue with the local people, and that's eventually what they did. That southern southwest portion, they kind of let that creep down to a safe area where they could stop it easily near the town and get the beneficial results out of it. Meanwhile, there was another fire burning in the hills in the kind of remote area, the mosquito fire. And this fire, it's got a very strange shape, don't you think? It's got all these little fingers and everything. And that's because, a week before the rains were supposed to come, the local people, again, were interacting with this incident management team. Now they maybe got to know them a little bit better. And they're having this dialogue about how to, address this complex, the mosquito complex. There's multiple fires actually out there. There's about 3 of them. And they were in a very remote area, hard to get to. A lot of other fires at the same time were taking precedence. Firefighters were having to deal with that. And so right before the rain came, the native folks and the non-native folks as well, living in Orleans, said, hey, people used to go and light off these ridges on fire right before the rain comes. That's what we used to do here. And that's what we should do. We see that rain's coming. And so that's what they did. They went and they ignited all of these ridge lines, um, and let the fire start to back down. And you can see in a lot of places it didn't get very far. The rain came in, put it out, but they got a lot of added beneficial fire out of that. So, that to me, this is a community that's seen many, many wildfires. They've seen a lot of destruction from fire, and they've really had to ask themselves a lot of questions about how to live with fire. And um, I think that's really interesting to see what they've come up with. And that's where we are today in this community, in our communities, many communities across the Klamath Mountains, people trying to learn how it is that we can live with fire, how we can accept its place in our landscape. It's so important for the biodiversity of this region. It's part of our cultures as well. And that's the challenge of our times, living in these fire-prone areas. So that's about all I have, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Great, thanks, Chris. So there are some questions here that I think kind of relate pretty directly to what you were just illustrating. And these questions have to do with, given this enormous need, if you will, for fire back on this landscape in a much broader area than what we've been allowing things to burn. A lot of that is public ground that's been for the last, many decades, over a century now, on really actively suppressing fire. How do you get that mindset changed, and how do we actually get fire back on there? Can we do it by prescribed fire alone, or are there other ways that we need to think about getting fire back on those landscapes?
Oh boy, there's not a day that goes by and I don't think about that question. So, you know, um, there's just so much there. There's just so much. One thing is that we got to kind of acknowledge that we're not in control. As a reality, and we're less and less in control. Our ability to prevent fires from happening was never that good, and it's getting worse. And the climate's getting warmer. We've created this synchrony again between climate and fire. So now we've hitched our wagon to this climate, you know, uh, that is drying, and so we know the area burn is going to triple by like 2050. That's not to be scary, right? This is the area burn, and I don't think it's bad for the area burn to necessarily increase. It's how it burns that troubles me. Um, but what I'm trying to say, I think, is that we're not necessarily going to be able to orchestrate and mastermind it all, right? We are working with nature here, and we have to, on some level, acknowledge what is not in our hands and what is. And sometimes we're always doing things. When it comes to putting out fires, we end up causing the opposite of what we want. We're putting out fires, and then eventually those fires do happen and it gets worse. I don't know how to change that mindset. I think that that's a very difficult thing. But in the example here from Orleans, what it comes down to is people in that community educated themselves. People in that community learned how to do prescribed fire. No, they're not burning the whole landscape, but they learn a lot about fire by doing that. And they gained a lot of credibility. So now when an incident management team from Georgia, Alaska, or something flies in, they know how incident management teams work. They go and they talk to them. They know who to talk to. They know how to talk the language. And they've spent decades, demonstrating, how they want to live with fire. And that includes a portion of letting fires, kind of clean up the backcountry while people are actively putting fires around communities. So you're acknowledging you can't go put those fires out in the wilderness. It would be, frankly, absurd to endanger the lives of firefighters in some of these really remote mountainous areas. So meanwhile, let's protect our communities with prescribed fire, and then when these fires happen, we can let them come down to the areas that we've already prescribed burn. So they have this vision, that it's taken them decades to formulate in that area. And I don't think we should beat ourselves up for not having all the answers. And I think we probably need to acknowledge that it's going to take a couple generations. Usually, it takes as long to solve a problem as it's taken to create it. So, you know, I think we're in for quite a journey, but all of the pieces of the puzzle are there. And we even have some of these examples we can look at for inspiration. And that's how I think about it. Now, I'm not saying I have all the answers. Probably some other people have thoughts, and sometime I'd love to chat about it.
So so you mentioned that high severity burns tend to be followed up by high severity burns. And so presumably that high severity burn kills a lot of the standing trees that are there. So that next burn is burning something different. So if those are regenerating over that time period to shrub fields, what's leading to that high severity in that next burn?
Well, shrub fields are extremely flammable. They have very continuous fuels over large distances, and and they can be quite windy because you don't have the trees there to block the wind or to sort of mitigate that. So that's kind of what's happening. Some of these areas become shrub fields that just will burn and regenerate as shrub fields and then burn again. The Slater fire has me quite worried. I'm about a mile from the Slater fire right now, and considering that the Kalmiopsis wilderness seems to be on a 15-year cycle, I think it's plausible that that's about when these reburns tend to happen. So that puts us in 2035. It's a very difficult thing to deal with once you have a huge area of brush. That's a huge management issue. It's very difficult to know what you can do really to promote that returning to a forested state in a climate that is going to encourage more frequent fire.
Yeah, and another compounding factor, and Ben asked about this, in many areas, particularly east of the Cascades, we have invasive annual grasses that are in a lot of these sites, and so our fire regimes are very much altered. Is that an issue in the region that you're talking about today? Or a significant issue?
You know, Funnily enough, I would say that we don't have a huge problem with invasive species in terms of the fire behavior. Some places, blackberries are a problem in riparian zones that can have a locally important impact. But at the scale of really, if you zoom out and look at the scale of wildfires today in this ecoregion, it's not got much to do with invasive species. So I'd say that on a local scale, it can be important, but broadly speaking, it's not a driving force. And a lot of the places that have burned are regenerating with native species. They're not transitioning to non-natives.
That's a blessing. So I think this is a good closing point. What the heck took us so long to figure out that fire isn't always bad and that native people probably knew what they were doing with their burning?
Well, that's a good question, and I hope that some of the historical quotes I presented also show that a lot of people were not in agreement with the policy that was adopted to just fight fires all the time. There were plenty of people who laid out very clearly what they thought was going to happen, and unfortunately, they were very right. We can't prevent fires from burning, and putting them out just makes future fires worse. Um, and that's a very tricky question to deal with now. Of course, if probably some people listening are like, is Chris just saying we should let all fires burn? No, it's much more complicated than that. We obviously are not in a position to do that either, but we have to make some very smart and complicated decisions. Um, and Yeah, I think that, but there's always a chance to learn. There's always a chance to listen, and probably today there are more opportunities to do that than in recent times. Let's say a lot of work that tribes are putting into educating other folks, especially in California. There's been a lot of reports written about the problem, led by authors from different tribes. A lot of research that's been um, by tribal native investigators, or in collaboration with tribes. A lot of advocacy and policy change work as well. So I think that, like I said, it's a good time to pay attention, and we've always got something to learn from that diversity that is such a cornerstone of our Klamath Mountains ecoregion, both ecologically and culturally.
Excellent. Chris, thank you so much. This has been super interesting. Lots of great information. For those of you that are waiting for the SAF keyword, it is Southwest. That's what Jake just posted into the chat. So again, Chris, thanks a bunch. This was excellent.
Thank you.